Now we'll begin the first session of the 2017 IFANS Conference on Global Affairs. 지금부터 2017 IFANS 국제문제회의 제1세션을 시작하겠습니다. The first session consists of two special speeches and a panel discussion under the theme of Resolving North Korean Nuclear Problem Through International Collaboration. 제1세션은 국제공조를 통한 북핵문제 해결이라는 주제로 국내외 저명 인사의 특별연설과 패널토론으로 진행됩니다. The first special speech will be delivered by General Colin Powell, the former United States Secretary of State. General Powell also served as the National Security Advisor for the Ronald Reagan Administration and as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for both President George H.W. Bush and for President Bill Clinton. 첫 번째 연설자이신 콜린 파월 전 국무부 장관님은 미국 레이건 정부의 국가안보 담당 보좌관, 부시 클린턴 정부의 합동참모본부 의장, 그리고 제65대 미국 국무부 장관을 역임하셨습니다. Please welcome General Colin Powell, former U.S. Secretary of State, to the stage with a big round of applause. 콜린 파월 전 장관님을 단상으로 모시겠습니다.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. It's always a great pleasure for me to be back in Korea. Korea means a great deal to me personally and professionally. My first visit to Korea and my first assignment in Korea was as a battalion commander guarding the DMZ. That was 43 years ago, and I was stationed at Tongdushan, Camp Casey. And we did all we could to make sure that if that war ever came, we would be ready with our Korean allies to face this enemy. It's a long time ago, and I've had a long military career after that. And during my military career, in addition to standing guard at places like the DMZ or the Iron Curtain in Europe, I learned a lot about nuclear weapons. As a young 25-year-old captain, I was first exposed to how one plans a nuclear attack. What would happen, the blast zone, the radiation, the heat, all the damage that could be done by a nuclear weapon. And then over the years, I actually had to understand how I would deploy them as a field commander. When I was a corps commander in Germany on the Iron Curtain, I had a corps of 70,000 soldiers, but we were sure that that would not stop all the Russian armies that would be coming at us. 3 armies were stacked up against my corps. And we knew that we would lose ground initially, and then if we didn't use nuclear weapons, we might lose our whole position. And so I understood that they were an essential part of our war plan. But the more I got to know about nuclear weapons, both as a captain, as a corps commander, and then when I became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Armed Forces of the United States, and I had under my responsibility, my staff responsibility, the management and the planning for the use of some 28,000 nuclear weapons if that ever came. And the one thing I became convinced of during that whole period, from captain all the way through chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is that these weapons must never, ever be used. The damage that will be done to the nations using them, the damage that will be done to the world, would also serve to destroy the political systems that existed in the world. So then in my diplomatic career, I spent a great deal of time on arms control and the elimination of nuclear weapons, working with some great diplomatic champions in our government. Some are here today. We have reduced significantly the number of nuclear weapons that we have and our major opponent had back then, the Soviet Union. And we've done it in a way that brought it down, but at the same time made sure we could still deter each other at a lower level of nuclear weapons activity. But in my heart and in my soul, I know that these are weapons that must never be used. And increasingly, I don't think people will see a reason to use them because the consequences of using them are so grave, and that even applies in the instance of North Korea. And so I'm a great believer in a denuclearized peninsula, but I'm a great believer in a denuclearized world. I hope we can continue to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in those nations that still have nuclear weapons. I'm pleased to have played a part in getting rid of the nuclear weapons that used to be in Libya or the programs that existed in Libya. When Libya realized that we have gained nothing by procuring this material to make weapons. We've gained nothing. We've just isolated ourselves from the rest of the world. We've got sanctions imposed on us. Nobody will come visit us. And finally, Libya woke up to the absurdity of nuclear weapons and gave them all up to the United States, and they're in a museum now in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in the United States. And I'll never forget the speech that Gaddafi gave to his people at the time. He said, I thought I was so smart, getting nuclear material, getting these weapons to protect us. But it turned out it wasn't protecting us, it was just isolating us. So look how really smart I am, I gave it all up. And that's what he did. I've also seen success after the Cold War where we were able to take all of the nuclear weapons that were located in Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus back into Russia, where they had been put under control. I've also watched more recently Iran, where Iran has contained its program in an agreement with the United States and several other nations to contain that program, and in a simple agreement, 18,000 centrifuges that were spinning to create the material for nuclear weapons has been reduced to just 6,000 for research and technical issues. And the programs are under control. Fissionable material is being shipped out of the country. So there are examples of how you can deal with this kind of proliferation. I'm all for using diplomacy and peaceful means to get rid of nuclear weapons throughout the world, and especially with respect to North Korea. I've been following North Korea ever since I was that young battalion commander 43 years ago. I have watched the whole peninsula over this period of time. I have watched South Korea go from a totalitarian form of government to a democracy, a full, beautiful democracy that flourishes. I have seen South Korea take advantage of that openness and take advantage of the strength of the Korean people and Korean industry to create an economy that is one of the best in the world, either 12th or 13th, depending on who's counting and who wants to claim credit for it being either 12th or 13th. But I've watched all of this with enormous affection for what the South Koreans have done. But at the same time, I also watch north over the 38th parallel to see what the North Koreans have not done, how they've devastated their people, how North Korean soldiers are shorter than South Korean soldiers, how people are starving under this regime that's been there for 69 years, from grandfather to father and now to son, all determined to make sure of one thing, that the regime is safe and the regime will continue. The most important, valuable thing to them is the existence of the regime, nothing else. And they will do whatever is necessary to make sure the regime is sustained. And this really is part of the background for considering the problem of nuclear weapons. They put on mass parades that are like nothing you will see anywhere else on Earth. And they parade missiles up and down the street, but at the same time it is a desperately poor country that can barely feed itself and relies on others to sustain it, principally China. And so I watch all of this and I try to get a sense of why are they doing this? What haven't they learned about the world and about the uselessness or usefulness of nuclear weapons? And I might say to myself, why would they ever use a nuclear weapon if they had one? What would it do for them? If the North Koreans had a nuclear weapon, and you hear all the bravado that comes out of them, all the bragging that comes out of them, but if they decided to strike Honolulu or San Francisco and destroy a neighborhood and kill thousands of Americans, how would this benefit them? What strategic gain would they get? Would they be better off? Would they prepare San Francisco for an invasion of some kind? No. Because they know for certainty that the day after they conducted such an attack, they would be attacked and the regime would not survive. So are they suicidal? No, I don't think so. The regime is the most important thing. And in all my presentations about this over the years, when I was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefing my Congress or other officials, I made it clear to them that if they ever used or ever had and used such a weapon, the United States would respond the next day and the regime would be gone. And I would give that assurance, and used to give that assurance when I was in government, to our friends and allies, my South Korean colleagues, my Japanese colleagues, and others. And we made sure that China and Russia and others in the region understood that that was the case. So are North Koreans interested in suicide? I don't think so. I think they are building these programs principally to be a deterrence. At least that's what they say. This is to keep America from attacking them. America has no interest in attacking them. When I was Secretary of State, I went and met with North Koreans after a break of a year. The first year of the administration, we didn't talk to them. And then President Bush, 43, turned me loose to start discussing these issues with the North Koreans. And in the very first meeting I had with the North Korean delegation in Asia, one of the Asia conferences, I said to them, you need to understand, we mean no ill to you. We don't approve of your political system and your regime, but it's yours. We're not going to take it out by military force. So we have no intention to attack North Korea. And President Bush wanted me to tell you, and you pass back to your leadership, that we are more interested in helping you deal with the problems you have in your country, the economic problems, the poverty problems, the lack of a real functioning, growing economy. That's what we want to help you with, not find a war to get into. And they all took copious notes and went back to Pyongyang, but nothing really changed. I formed a 6-party framework that is still in existence, but after many, many meetings, we found that not only were we not making progress with the North Koreans, but very often when we were making progress over here, they were doing something over there that we had to discover by intelligence sources. And so it was always a problem. But the one thing I know is they are not crazy. Many of my colleagues in America would say that Kim Jong-un is crazy, the regime is crazy. The regime may be crazy, but for 69 years they have acted very, very cleverly and deliberately within that regime. And Kim Jong-un is doing the same thing right now. But to use such a weapon against the United States or against any of our friends and allies, or if we suspected such a weapon was about to be used, we need to make sure that Kim Jong-un understands it would be the destruction of his regime beginning the very next day. And I've been saying that for decades. So he is not interested in committing assisted suicide, and I don't know what possible strategic gain he thinks he could achieve by using such a weapon. The second thing that I kind of think through late at night is, would the Chinese ever let him do such a thing? Well, can the Chinese control him? Chinese really have the ignition key to the North Korean car. They provide the energy, they provide the resources that keep that regime going. And so China plays an interesting role in all of this. I think they have the ability to turn it off. But I think that China has a reason for sustaining this regime or not working hard to take it out. Yes, they apply sanctions. Yes, they do other things as part of the UN resolutions, but they never really go after North Korea. Why? Because it is a useful buffer, in my humble judgment, a useful buffer between 38th parallel South Korea and the United States and the Chinese border along the Yalu River. And they don't want to see the regime go down, because if the regime were to go down, if we were to take it out because of the use of a nuclear weapon or the possible use of a nuclear weapon, we'd have 25 million North Koreans standing around wondering what to do next. And they will try to go north to China or south to South Korea. A degree of instability that would take place in this country that we better think through carefully as we make bold statements about how we're going to see fire and all kinds of things up in North Korea. We have seen how mistakes can be made when you don't realize that when you take out a regime, you become responsible for the regime. And I don't know of anybody around here or in my part of the world that would be interested in becoming responsible for 25 million North Korean citizens. And so I think there's every reason to believe that North Korea sees this as a deterrent. And I hope they're smart enough to realize, clever enough to realize that for all their bluster, they need to understand they would be committing suicide. and I think they're too smart to want to commit suicide. The next point that occurs to me late at night as I think through these issues is that there are 193 nations in the world. My number may be off by a few, but it's close to that. 193 nations in the UN General Assembly. No nation has used a nuclear weapon since 1945, August, and that was the United States of America. We did it twice, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As a soldier, I have watched those films of the bombings and the aftermath of the bombings over and over, thinking what could happen if anything like that happened again with weapons that are 10 or 100 times more powerful than the weapons we used in Japan back in August of 1945. And it's almost unthinkable. It's almost impossible to grasp. And if any one of these 193 nations were to use such a weapon now, the other 192 would all stand up and protest, not only protest, but go after this regime and ensure that it is taken down. So would I do anything differently than what's being done? A couple of things. One, the things we would continue to do, push the diplomatic peace. Keep pushing it, keep sanctioning, keep constraining, keep dealing and talking to the North Koreans. It doesn't hurt to talk to people. You don't lose much by talking to people, even if you don't see the kind of progress that you'd like to see. So keep up the diplomacy, keep up the political action, keep up the sanctions, keep condemning them for what they are doing. But the other thing that I would suggest to my friends in Washington, and remember, I do not speak for the United States government. I'm just a poor pensioner doing the best I can. But the other point I would make is that the North Koreans absolutely enjoy it when they shoot a rocket and we, built up by television, we're going crazy in UN Security Council meetings and resolutions. It just makes him more important. Kim Jong-un wallows in that kind of attention. A couple of weeks ago, he fired some missiles in special UN session. And we shipped over airplanes and bombers and fighters to fly around. And then for almost a month, he didn't do anything. He didn't shoot any rockets. And the media was starting to say, aha, there's an opening now. We can use this 1 month quiet to begin a new negotiation with him. And then suddenly he shot a rocket, which went higher than any other rocket. And where does the television footage come from? The North Koreans are giving it to us. And it goes out on CNN and MSNBC and BBC and everywhere else, gets everybody excited. And then we respond with very, very aggressive statements back. And then a few days later, the media dries up and we wait for him to do the next thing. I don't think this helps. I think it might be useful if, when he takes these provocative acts, we might just say, what was that? As opposed to getting all riled up every single time, because it really empowers him in his own mind, and I don't think it helps serve the cause of finding a proper way forward through diplomatic and political actions. And so it is a dangerous world with these kinds of weapons. I fully support what you see behind me, the denuclearization of the peninsula. I'm proud to have been involved in a number of negotiations that reduced nuclear weapons throughout the world over the years. And I hope that with goodwill on the part of my South Korean brothers and sisters, goodwill on the part of the other nations in this part of the world, with the leadership of the United States of America and other nations, we keep the pressure on North Korea. But remember, we're the ones who have to do it. We've got to come together as a team. But we cannot keep leaving the initiative in his hand. When he decides when he's going to shoot another rocket, or when he decides that he's going to have a nuclear test, he has the initiative, and he uses it. Security Council meetings, resolutions, new sanctions, yet the country still exists. It continues to go on. It's not being crushed by this. And so we should start looking at ways to take that initiative away from him by us not responding in the way that he knows we will and the way he likes us to. And so let's all leave here this morning committed to the prospect of denuclearization of the peninsula and the continued denuclearization of the world, which is a long way off. But you do it step by step, agreement by agreement, until we reach that end point. And I'm so pleased that my colleagues here in South Korea, my friends, all the people I know here in this country, and the politicians and diplomats I work with, I'm so glad that you remain totally committed, and your president remains totally committed through collaboration, international collaboration, to find a way to deal with this problem in a peaceful manner. And I hope the day will come when the North Koreans realize that a better life is waiting for them. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you, General Colin Powell, for sharing your expertise and insight on the Korean Peninsula and the North Korean nuclear issue. 한반도 및 북핵 문제에 대한 고견을 나눠주신 콜린 파월 전 장관님께 다시 한번 감사의 말씀드립니다. The next speech will be delivered by Mr. Kevin Rudd, who has served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the 26th Prime Minister of Australia. 두 번째 연설자이신 케빈 러드 전 호주 총리님은 호주 외교통상부 장관과 제26대 호주 총리를 역임하셨습니다. Mr. Rudd, please come up to the stage. Everyone, please welcome him with a big hand.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister. Thank you for your hospitality and being here. To Chancellor Cho, to my good friend Colin Powell, good to see you back in harness, my fellow pensioner. And also, I think, Ambassador Tom Pickering and others who are here with us today. And thank you to the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security, the Korean Diplomatic Academy, and also the APLN, the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network, which is co-convened by my good friend and fellow Australian Ramesh Thakur, who's here as well. The aim of this conference is to find a new approach to denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. It's an important objective, it's an urgent objective. Whether we succeed or not is an open question for us all. But if we are to curtail or bring about a cessation of North Korea's nuclear program, diplomacy is essential. And if Colin Powell has done nothing else this morning, he has reminded us of the consequences of the actual use of nuclear weapons. Diplomacy, therefore, remains essential to our project. So I commend the conference for seeking to explore practical diplomatic options towards a solution acceptable to the various parties. None of us have any particularly unique wisdom on these questions. It's always good, as I would say in Australian politics, every now and then, just to shake the tree. You never quite know what fruit might fall to the ground. North Korea has consumed much of our collective thinking over the past year. Many of us are trying to understand what to do about a nation that now poses not only a direct threat to our friends and allies in South Korea and Japan, but also now a threat to the continental United States. I've been a close observer of events on the Korean Peninsula for the better part of 35 years. At one period of time in the Australian Foreign Ministry, I had some responsibilities for our bilateral dealings with the North Koreans. I can report to you all carefully that I survived. I have had the privilege of visiting this great country many times under different presidents. And I've also been to North Korea on several occasions. So let me say from the outset, I do not underestimate the complexity of the task. It is deeply complex. But I fundamentally believe that preserving the peace and prosperity and livelihoods of the people of this peninsula, both south and north, must be our first priority. Armed conflict on the peninsula is certainly an increasing possibility, but not a probability. My own judgment is that the possibility is somewhere now above 25%. It's certainly a lot less than 50%, as some recent commentators have indicated in the United States. But I think all of us are worried, including myself, that this number continues to creep upwards. This assessment has been driven by the very public advances, of course, in North Korea's own nuclear capabilities, most recently demonstrated with the launch of the Hwasong-15 intercontinental ballistic missile, which many analysts believe has the range to strike the east coast of the continental United States. The core reason given by the North Koreans for the development of its missile and nuclear programs is, of course, regime survival. But there is also the deeply troubling question of how far Kim is prepared to go to reunify the Korean Peninsula. That we do not know with any certainty, but it brings the predicament facing us into very sharp relief. I've just come from China. I go there a lot. I know more about that country than I do about this one and Japan. It's simply a product of knowing the language and having been posted there as a diplomat and having visited there more than 100 times over the last 35 years in various capacities. I think in China there is a fairly brutal assessment about how this scenario on the Korean Peninsula may play out. Whatever pause or cessation of the North Korean nuclear program might be deliverable, I think there is a Chinese view that sees little chance that North Koreans will scrap their nuclear bombs or ballistic missiles altogether. Many of our Chinese friends ultimately believe the US is going to have to live with North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. Some Chinese friends also believe that a North Korean nuclear capability at the end of the day is a 9 out of 10 problem for America and a 1 out of 10 problem for China. This is important to understand as it in turn shapes the content and trajectory of China's North Korean diplomacy. So what are the possible scenarios? Scenario one, that the US, as China would wish, informally accepts North Korea becoming part of the global nuclear weapons club, and that the North develops its own set of rules, procedures, and perhaps even a nuclear doctrine, perhaps in consultation with others, that enables it to behave responsibly as a nuclear weapons state. Scenario two involves one form or other of a US unilateral military strike to destroy or at least retard the North Korean nuclear capability. Until recently, the view in Beijing was that Washington would never risk the consequences for its South Korean and Japanese allies, and indeed the future of these alliances, by acting unilaterally in such a manner. This view is also held by many others in the wider region around the world. But having had numerous conversations with Chinese friends and colleagues over the past few months, I sense that this view may be beginning to change. There is now a stronger sense that the Trump administration might in fact be prepared to use unilateral military action against the North. Hence, I believe the dispatch of senior foreign ministry official Zheng Zeguang to Washington last week. What's the third scenario? Of course, it's diplomacy. But a potential diplomatic solution to the crisis faces itself almost impossible hurdles. First, the US expectation is that China will intervene politically, diplomatically, economically, and militarily to pressure and even perhaps force Pyongyang to change course on its nuclear policy. China responds by saying there is a limit to what it can do or what it is prepared to do. Indeed, privately, Chinese friends will ask, what's in such an approach for China itself? The Chinese, in my experience, ask 5 core questions about all of this. 1, why should we, the Chinese, make a permanent enemy out of the North? 2, why should we cause the North to look to Russia rather than China for protection and international support, thereby enhancing Moscow's stocks in Pyongyang and decreasing Beijing's stocks? 3, why should we Chinese cause the current regime in Pyongyang to topple without knowing what will replace it? 4, why should we be then left with dealing with the massive humanitarian consequences from North Korea as a result of regime collapse? And 5, why should we Chinese risk the run the risk of Korean unification on either US or South Korean terms, thereby placing a de facto US ally right along China's border, a point just referred to by Colin Powell in his presentation. The truth is, I hear all these things in Beijing from different parts of the Chinese foreign policy establishment. I also believe these reflect a deep conservatism in China's overall strategic culture. China, historically, at least in the post-78 period, is not in the business of grand strategic risk-taking. It has a view that the current situation, while not desirable, is at least tolerable. It also has a view that taking bold diplomatic and political and economic action to change circumstances radically on the ground runs against the deep grain of this conservatism. It will take a lot to dislodge that conservative strategic culture. It is grounded in deep historical experience. Of course, there is a different logic as well, which China also understands and is also discussed within the Chinese system. This logic goes along these lines, that the THAAD deployments in South Korea are a direct result of the North's nuclear weapons advances, that the North's behaviour towards the South is drawing the South and the United States even closer together, and that the debate in the South to acquire its own independent nuclear deterrent will intensify, with newspaper polls in the South already pointing to significant numbers of South Koreans supporting the ROK going nuclear, and that a parallel set of forces are now being unleashed in Abe's Japan, with changes in Japan's military posture, its military budget, and related constitutional arrangements for the deployment of its defence capabilities. Therefore, the internal debate on North Korea and China is a complex debate. And internally, both sets of voices are heard, but the first set of voices, the strategically conservative set of voices that I referred to before, I believe at this stage are well and truly dominant. Following President Trump's visit to Beijing, China dispatched the head of the party's international department, Song Tao, to Pyongyang on a diplomatic mission. But Kim Jong-un did not receive him, and Song Tao appears to have returned to Beijing empty-handed. Of course, other diplomatic channels have recently opened up as well. Russia has been engaging North Korea, and it is understood from the Russians that there is a preparedness on Pyongyang's part to now engage in direct bilateral discussions with the United States. I regard this piece of Russian diplomacy as actually a positive development that may not be universally held in this room. But at least the North Koreans are talking to somebody, and all the doors have not yet closed. We've also just seen a visit to Pyongyang by the Director of Political Affairs of the United Nations, Jeff Feltman, a good friend of Foreign Minister Kang and myself, and himself, of course, a former US diplomat. And the public statements by both the UN and the North Korean Foreign Minister seem to indicate that North Korea is prepared to keep the UN channel open as well. I also see this as a positive development, and I commend the UN Secretary General for taking this initiative. However, the channels of diplomatic communication may be one thing, but the real question remains about the possible shape and content of any final diplomatic solution on the other. This is where the debate becomes really very hard. There are some who suggest that a settlement lies in North Korea agreeing to freeze, abandon, or in its most ambitious version, destroy its ICBM capabilities. As we all know, this program is already highly developed, and that was further demonstrated by the Hwasong-15 launch recently. There is an open question as to whether any such North Korean assurances on ICBMs would be seen as credible, verifiable, or let alone acceptable in Washington. And this leaves to one side entirely the continued accumulation of North Korean nuclear material, which adds to the accumulation of Pyongyang's existing nuclear weapons stockpile. The estimates vary, as you all know, but there is some consensus around the number of 30 to 50 nuclear bombs already being in the North's possession. And let us all remember that these nuclear bombs can always be delivered by the crudest of platforms, not necessarily involving a ballistic missile. A further problem with this approach is where does it leave South Korea and Japan, and for that matter, US territories in the Pacific, most notably Guam, in terms of the existing reach of North Korean short and medium-range missiles, as well as North Korea's emerging SLBM capabilities, of which we've seen some evidence in recent years. The possible danger for South Korea and Japan is if the United States were to cut a deal with the North on its ICBM capabilities, does this then leave Seoul and Tokyo at the mercy of North Korean nuclear blackmail in the future? In other words, does this result in time in a classic decoupling of the US from its Northeast Asian allies? For Seoul and Tokyo to accept such a deal from the United States would require faith in two propositions. A, that the US global strategic nuclear umbrella would automatically extend to any tactical threats against its Northeast Asian allies. And B, given that the North Koreans have a reputation for risky behaviour, although, as Colin has just reminded, not insane behaviour, would such guarantees by the United States to its Northeast Asian allies about the coverage of the US strategic nuclear umbrella be seen in Pyongyang as credible? What would be the content of any such nuclear blackmail by the North against a more isolated and potentially more vulnerable South Korea and Japan? On that question, North Korean potential behaviour would be unpredictable. It might include pressure on both South Korea and Japan to incrementally reduce their reliance on the United States as an ally, with the ultimate objective of having them repudiate these alliances over time. For the South, it could involve threats aimed at forcing a particular form of reunification between North and South, presumably weighted in North Korea's direction. Some may regard such potential threats as so risky that they would never be delivered by the North under these circumstances. But I'm not so sure North Korea's regional international behaviours give us grounds for such confidence. And of course, all these considerations leave to one side the continued exposure of US forces in South Korea, Okinawa, and most particularly Guam, which is US territory. Therefore, while a number of analysts may point to the elegance of such an ICBM freeze by the North, even extending to verifiable cessation and even destruction of its ICBM capabilities, the capabilities that would remain in place in the hands of the North would continue to have formidable military, diplomatic, and political potential. And I'm not sure, therefore, whether such an approach would be acceptable in either Seoul or Tokyo. And we should remember that one of Pyongyang's core strategic objectives, also shared by certain other states, is to shatter US alliance solidarity over time. Of course, this is not the only diplomatic initiative on the table. There are many others. And as I said at the outset, hopefully others will emerge as a consequence of this gathering here in Seoul at this particular conference. One such possibility, of course, is generally referred to as a long-term grand bargain for the future of the Korean Peninsula, involving an immediate freeze on the part of the North, a timetable for the destruction of its remaining nuclear capabilities, in exchange for the armistice becoming a peace treaty, external security guarantees from other states, including the United States and China, for the regime itself, the economic construction of the North over time, and perhaps the future adjustment of US force posture here on the peninsula itself. In some respects, this has some resonances with the discussions which occurred way back in 1994. As Foreign Minister Lavrov said last week, and I quote him, "We know that North Korea wants above all to talk to the United States about guarantees for its security, and we, the Russian Federation, are ready to support that." Secretary General Guterres has stated ahead of his visit to Japan this week that we want the denuclearization of the peninsula to be achieved through meaningful dialogue, open dialogue, constructive dialogue. Or, as Churchill more famously said, being given to jaw is much better than war. And we all, as professional diplomats in this room, would understand that. But the difficulties I've just referred to cannot simply be papered over in terms of the final content of any proposed direct diplomacy between Pyongyang and Washington. And of course, those of us who have spent our lifetime in politics and diplomacy understand the importance of remaining professional optimists about possible breakthroughs remains. And all of us must continue to work hard as possible. But we should be sober about where this road may end up. And this also leads us to the unpredictable political personality that is President Trump himself. Those who know him well argue that tough talk from the President on the possibility of unilateral military action is simply consistent with his general negotiating style, starting with the New York property market. And this is purely designed to soften up his interlocutors in order to land a deal which is considerably different to the one that he's publicly articulated in the first place. I have to confess, although I'm not an American, although I now live there, I'm not so confident about that. I also notice that when I'm travelling in Beijing over the last 12 months, when I have warned of the growing possibility of unilateral US military action, my Chinese friends have discounted such a possibility as US diplomatic bluff, and in particular bluff from a president known for bluff. And a bluff that is designed primarily to cause a deep change in China's own diplomacy towards the DPRK. But as I've already noted in my remarks this morning, in the last short period of time, the last several weeks, I've detected a certain change in Beijing's attitude, as well as on this core question of the possibility of some form or other of a US military strike against the North's nuclear capabilities. As I've said before, the dispatch last week of Senior Foreign Ministry official Zhang Ziguang reflects Chinese concerns about this contingency. Let me conclude. I'm a long-term friend of the ROK. I can't remember how many times I've been here, not as many as you, Colin, but I've been here a lot. We regard you folks in South Korea as part of our family. And we feel deeply, since the events of the Korean War in 1950-53, about your future. And therefore, when I come to this city and I look out this morning over the great city of Seoul, my first concern as a humanitarian is the well-being of the 20 million residents of the Greater Seoul metropolitan area and the people more broadly of this country. This city has already seen massive destruction some 2/3 of a century ago. None of us wish to see that again, least of all the people of this great city. Therefore, all of us must redouble our efforts. And we all, I believe, wish President Moon well as he embarks on his diplomatic mission to Beijing later this week. If and when we are able to achieve a diplomatic breakthrough on North Korea, I would also conclude with this. Let us also, as a region, consider how we better manage unresolved territorial disputes which plague our wider region for the medium to long-term future as well. We all understand the new geopolitical instabilities which are arising in our wider region. I don't intend to list them. They're all known to people in this room. That is why in the future, I argue that we need to begin to act more as a regional family in dealing with various of these problems. That is why, for example, over the last 2 years, a team of us, as former senior ministers and officials from many of the states of the region, have worked to develop concepts for additional regional security architecture for the future, producing a consensus report in support of an expanded role for the East Asian Summit, even developing in the direction of a long-term Asia-Pacific community. This is not about utopianism. In fact, it's quite a practical set of recommendations about how we turn what is an institutionally deficient region into one which develops instead the institutions of collaboration more broadly across this part of the world, and in time deals with the great Asian paradox, a region which is now central to the global economy, a region which is now drawn together more tightly by economic integration, yet a region which is actually seeing an explosion in defence expenditures and military expenditures and a multitude of unresolved territorial disputes, each of which is capable of bubbling to the surface. I note in passing that there are 2 regions in the world which do not have pan-regional, let's call it security architecture. One is the Middle East and the second is East Asia. And I think we should reflect instead what has happened in the African Union, in Africa's case, in Latin America with the OAS in recent times in particular, and also the European Union. There are lessons, I think, for us in this part of the world to draw from that. This particular set of recommendations for an enhanced East Asian summit was put together by an international panel chaired by myself, but involving former Foreign Minister Kim of this country, Yoriko Kawaguchi from Japan, the former Foreign Minister, Tom Donilon, the former National Security Advisor of the United States, Igor Ivanov, the former Foreign Minister of Russia, Shivshankar Menon, the former National Security Advisor of India, and Marty Natalegawa, the former Foreign Minister of Indonesia. Let me tell you, achieving consensus among those guys was pretty hard, but we got there because all of us have been senior practitioners. We understand, not with a sense of romance or remote idealism, but with deep pragmatism, the need to develop cultures of security collaboration, not just confrontation. We need to develop a culture of greater dialogue, greater transparency, and greater cooperation on common security challenges, building a level of strategic trust over time. I don't intend to go into the details of the recommendation. You can find them on the Asia Society Policy Institute website, of which I'm president and which is based in New York. I'd encourage you to read it. I know our Chinese friends are now looking at it seriously, and so are other governments in the region. But the central point is that we need an enhanced regional security architecture to help us address the challenges of our neighbourhood altogether. And an enhanced EAS would not replace existing alliance structures. They will remain, but they may help just bring the temperature down and cause us not to bilateralise every security tension which arises. And therefore, I commend it to this conference's attention for the medium to longer term. Friends, we are living through a troubling and uncertain age. A durable solution to the challenge of North Korea will require creative thinking, great statesmanship, and great scholarship. But diplomacy is the only way to avoid a repeat of the tragedies of the 20th century. My Australian compatriot wrote a book recently entitled Sleepwalkers: How Europe Sleptwalked Its Way to the Great War of 1914. It's a book I'd commend to your attention. It's a book written by Chris Clark from Cambridge University, which maps out the failed diplomacy in the years leading to 1914 and in 1914 itself. It's a cautionary tale for all of us. And the main part of the cautionary tale is, despite all the preparations for war, none of the principal parties actually believed that war was possible. And so they sleptwalked into war. I think we in this region, made up of some very smart people from some ancient civilizations with great collective wisdom, need to reflect on Europe's record on this question. Again, Colin Powell has told us that it wouldn't just be 1914, it would be 1914 with nuclear weapons, a future which is simply impossible to contemplate without any sense of humanity being destroyed. So friends, let us learn from history. Let us not repeat it. It's a pleasure to address you this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd, for sharing your expertise with us on the Korean Peninsula and the East Asian security. 동아시아 안보 및 한반도 문제에 대한 해안을 나눠주신 케빈 러드 전 총리님께 감사드립니다. Those were two truly meaningful speeches that will help us, no doubt, in our journey to make a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula. So everyone, please give another round of applause for our two speakers. 대단히 감사합니다. 한반도 비핵화를 위한 뜻깊은 연설이었습니다.